Hello, this is Lawrence Romanosky from Calgary, Canada, and this is the second installment of a blog that I'm doing on classic cars. The first one touched on how to choose the right people or shop to restore your car, and then how to choose that car. I'll elaborate more on how to choose the car in this vlog. Okay, so with collectors, it doesn't matter if it's cars or anything else or watches or whatever. What we try to do is we try to put every item in its own hierarchy, and everything else being equal, which is the more collectible than the other. And we arrange all of these cars within individual makes and models and years, and comparing different decades and different runs of cars, etc. And what we try to do is we try to establish this hierarchy or this pecking order. Okay, so even if you have the world's most valuable car, even if you have a Ferrari 250 GTO, there are 37 of them made. Well, even within that realm, there are good ones, and for lack of a better term, bad. Even the bad ones were $35 million. We'd all be happy to have a bad Ferrari GTO. But in the GTO world, there's the top valued ones, which might be $70 million one just sold for. It's possible one might even sell for more than that. And I think one sold at auction for, I think it was $37 million, if I'm not mistaken, at Bonhams. Okay. Now, what makes the difference? Well, with each individual car, there's a whole bunch of criteria. In the case of an old racing car, it would be provenance, it would be race history, it would be how much of the original DNA from the 1960s exists today. I mean, was the car entirely recreated from a piece of tubing? Were there 3 cars made because one was crashed and the engine went somewhere and the chassis went somewhere else and the body went somewhere else, and each person then took each of these parts and made a different car of it, and they all claimed the same chassis number, and that gives rise to the joke of, well, there was whatever it was, 24 Jag C-types made and 36 survive, and that will be why. So you would for those cars, there's questions of, like I said, provenance and documentation and all sorts of things. And particularly with old race cars from 50s and 60s, the manufacturers played around with the VINs when they were importing cars back and forth between different countries, and cars were rebodied many times, and engines were taken out of one car and stuck in another. Nobody cared about provenance back then. They just cared about winning the races. Anyway, suffice to say that even within the realm of a Ferrari 250 GTO, the collectors will put them in a different pecking order, best to worst. Okay, and so with every mark is the same way. There will be some cars that are worth more than others, everything else being equal. So generally speaking, when you have a run of a certain collector car, and maybe that's 8 or 10 or as long as 20 years, collectors will generally value the first one and the last one at the highest. Sometimes they're equally as valuable. Sometimes more weight's placed on the first one. Sometimes more weight is placed on the last one, and every car is a little bit different. Okay, so usually the collectors like the first one for design purity. The way the original designer penned the car and its original form. Then what happens though is, with a vehicle, especially if the life is 10 or 15 or 20 years, it has to be made to fulfill regulations in different parts of the world which change, and things get added, and the car can grow, especially in the transition from the 60s to the 70s, grow ugly bumper covers if the safety regulations were not well resolved at the time, emission control, etc., etc. Also, the cars will generally get developed, and through the lifespan, they'll get a little bit more easier to drive, perhaps. Better gearboxes, better cooling for the engine, more reliable, etc. So generally, at the end of the production life, the car will have the benefit of development over its lifespan, and it'll be the better car to drive. So now there's cars where the design purity at the beginning would kind of take precedence. Let's say a Jaguar E-Type, the very first E-Types. It was an iconic car. It was a very important car in the period. It offered, Ferrari-like performance at a modest price, and it was it was a sensational debut. It was the most beautiful car in the world, many people thought, including Enzo Ferrari. And it never really regained that impact, even though it was developed from, 62 or 3 or whatever it was, all the way to 1975. Now, the 1973, 4, 72, 3, 4, and 5 cars were V12s, Series 3s. The performance was regained by, a 5.3 liter V12 engine. However, a great Series 1 E-Type, might command $250,000, and a great Series 3 E-Type, still only half of that, 125 maybe, and the ones in the middle might be in the 60s and 70s. So let's just, as an example, I'll run through some of the reference books behind me, and I'll just see, what a collector's value, the first one or the last one. Well, there might even be one where there's one in the middle. So let's just take a look and then see what these say. Okay, the Land Rovers, the original Land Rovers. Well, clearly the Series 1 Land Rover of the early 50s was, an iconic vehicle. It made a huge difference to Rover. It saved the company, and it was the first of its. It was based on the Jeep, but it was the first. It was the first car, they say, that a third of the world's population saw. It was a Land Rover. Okay, so the very first ones are the most valuable, and you might see a great Series 1. I did a restoration of one. You might see that at $100,000, but a lot of guys really like the later Defender 90s, and especially the ones with the V8 engine and all the accessories and so forth. And they would be worth, they can be worth even more than $100,000. Okay, so that one, the very first and the very last ones, probably are about the same. Ferrari V12s, well, they didn't make, a lot of the V12s are small production runs, but if we take something like a Ferrari Boxer, when it first came out, it was 365 GTB4, is that right? 365 GTB4, and that one with the 3 taillights and the 3 exhausts is more valuable than the 512 BBI, which would have went on a production in the 80s. So in that case, the first version, and also they made smaller production numbers of it, would be more valuable than the last one. Also with the Testarossa, the very first car in 1984, with the center lock wheels and the one single mirror that kind of shoots out from the door pillar, is worth more than the mid ones. And the last one, the Ferrari 512 TR, the most highly developed, the fastest, etc., is worth the most. The ones in the middle are worth less. The Ferrari V8, well, the very first Ferrari 308s, they were fiberglass, and they didn't make very many, and there was very good quality bodywork, even though it's fiberglass, and they're quite a bit lighter than the steel cars. Those ones command a substantial premium over the last one, the 328s. Now, within accepting the fiberglass ones, there are only a few hundred of those, I believe, a few thousand maybe. Accepting those, the later 328 GTB and GTS with the ABS brakes, they're worth more than the earlier ones because they're more highly developed and more drivable, okay? But the first fiberglass cars are definitely worth the most. Mercedes SLs, this is the Pagoda. Well, the original 230 SL was lighter. More of those had the 4-speed gearbox, and they're worth more than the 250s. And the latest ones, the 280s, are probably worth about the same as the 230. So again, that holds true. Rolls-Royce and Bentley, difficult to say. Not many of them are worth that much because the costs of restoring them are so steep. But if you took let's just pick a Silver Cloud or something, so it came out in 50, what would it be, 55, I guess, 55, and it would have had a straight 6 engine. Then the Silver Cloud 2 had the V8, and the Silver Cloud 3 was the most highly developed. In this case, the most highly developed Silver Cloud 3 would be worth more than the other two, with the very first ones being second to the last ones. Okay. Jaguar XKs, the XK120 definitely would be worth the most, particularly the first alloy body cars. The XK140 less, and at the end of the line, the XK150 not as much as the first one. Again, I think these cars that had really substantial impact when they came out, when they really sort of reset the automotive performance standards of the day or whatever, as an XK120 did, as an E-Type did. Those cars became iconic, and again, when they were released, they had huge impact on the automotive scene. And a car like that, I think generally when it is first introduced, then the original versions would generally command more than the later versions. Okay? Well, Morgans are kind of a funny thing. They started out with Ford engine and then Triumph engine cars, 2.2 liters or whatever. Then they got the Rover 3500 V8. Okay, so the +8 versions of the Morgan are worth far more than the 4 cylinders. It went from a 4-cylinder to an 8-cylinder, and that made a huge difference. So the Morgan again would be, the later version of the Morgan would be more valuable than the first. The Range Rover, well, definitely the very first Range Rovers are now really collectible. We can see up to $100,000 for an early two-door, early 70s restored Range Rover. And the later ones, they wouldn't be worth much at all. 25 grand or something like that, even for a nice one. So in this case, the first Range Rover, again, the very first kind of luxury off-roader, made it, again, it was a hugely important car in the time, and the original one commands the money. The Jaguars, well, they were developed from 3.4 and 3.8, and the 3.8 ones with a higher performance. So in this case, the later Mark IIs would have had much greater performance than the earlier ones, offsetting any sort of original design purity. In this case, the Jaguar, the later Mark IIs with 3.8 engine, would be worth more than the earlier ones. Talked about the E-Type. Well, the Astons are a bit of a funny thing because the first ones, the DB2s, DB24s, are worth nowhere near as much as the DB4s and the DB5s, and the DB6s are worth less. It's a bit of an unusual thing because, of course, the DB5 is the iconic James Bond Goldfinger Aston Martin, and that means that that particular car is worth far more than the ones that were before or after. The earlier ones, the DB2s, I don't know why they're not worth as much as the DB6, but there you go. I think they're. I think they should be worth as much as the DB6, but they're not. Okay. The Jags, we talked about those. The Triumph, well, the first TR2 would be worth a lot of the original design, but the most highly developed line of those cars going all the way up to the TR6. The TR6 is, well, maybe worth about the same, but definitely a TR2 and a TR6 are worth more ones in the middle. And lastly, I guess maybe we can talk about an Austin Healey. The first ones, the 104, again, a groundbreaking car, kind of halfway between an MG and a Jag. Extraordinarily beautiful car, particularly in the early 4-cylinder versions, and those cars are worth the most, particularly if it's a 100M, which is the Le Mans kit on it. Some were from the factory, some dealer installed, but if you get a factory 100M, it can be worth $150,000 or $200,000. And the last one, the BJ8 in 1968, even though it was not a competitive car in 1968, it had roll-up windows and more comfortable seats and higher ground clearance and a little bit more usable than a wooden dash. And it, for whatever reason, it is worth, well, it's a nice car. It would be worth as much as a normal 104, or even probably a little bit more than that, although not as much as a 100M. Okay, so I guess the point I'm making here is that dependent on a whole bunch of factors, production volume, oftentimes when they start to make the cars, they don't make that many. Oftentimes they don't know how successful the car is going to be, and so the tooling is a lot more simple, and there's a lot more handwork in it, because of course if you don't know how many of the cars you're going to make, you're not going to invest in a massive amounts of tooling for it. It'll be better to do it by hand. But then as volume increases and demand increases, it makes sense though to go to more mechanization and standardization and less handwork and so forth. That makes the original cars that have more handwork in them a little bit more desirable than the later cars. Okay, so that's a factor. The impact when it came out, I think, is another really important factor as well. And then how materially different the car was at the end than at the beginning. So there are some cars, especially those that have undergone an engine change, like a Morgan from a +4 to +8, or let's say a Mercedes 280 SE W111. That's the beautiful sort of opera coupe with the lots of wood in it and the oversized leather chairs from the 60s and early 70s. The 280 SE 3.5 Cabriolet can be $300,000 car or more, whereas the 220 version of that car would maybe only be a third or a quarter of that. Well, going from a 2.2 liter straight six to a 3.5 liter V8 transformed the car, and the later ones were just so much more modern to drive. Okay, so that's an example where the development of the car has been substantial, and the valuation of the later car is a lot more. There's other cars where they've made them for 50 years or something, where a Porsche 911 or a Corvette or something like that, and each different version of that might be worth more or less than the next one. It might necessarily not be linear, like the first 911s, the very first 64, 65 cars are worth the most. Then there's certain cars peppered throughout their lineage, the 73 cars, especially the RS, the 76 930 when it came out. Again, cars with competition history, cars that made a big impact on performance, like the 930. These iconic cars will generally be elevated in value, and the ones in between not so much. So when you are looking to restore a car, it would be worthwhile to really study the market and get a feel for within this production range, within this type of car, what collectors will value in terms of the year, and then make sure you start with the right car, particularly if it's a ground-up restoration, and this restoration is going to cost $100,000 or $100,000 or $150,000. Choosing the right car to start with will make all the difference when it comes time to sell the car, or even just for your own peace of mind that it's worth this kind of investment. If you're going to spend the money on restoring an old body shell or an old Mercedes body shell, make sure it's got the 3.5 liter engine in it when you're done with it. Okay, so I hope that was helpful, and it may just be common sense, but it's interesting how each different model and mark is treated and characterized a little bit differently by collectors. Okay, thank you very much. Lawrence Romanosky from Calgary, Canada.